Having finished the 2 gaming tables I've been working on, I thought it would be a good opportunity to show one of the other armies on the channel. I started a few armies here and there since getting back into the hobby in about 2017 or so, mostly adapting and building on top of past collections I'd had for fantasy, but Nurgle's the only one I built up exclusively for Age of Sigmar. I'm slightly more drawn to the mortal side rather than demons with Nurgle, so the real backbone of the collection are the 20 Blight Kings, which I filled with the Lord of Blight, Harbinger of Decay, and Rotbringer Sorcerer as a Blight Cis battalion. I loved experimenting with the different builds I could get out of this set to avoid any repetition between the different units. Best demonstration of this is probably with the command groups of each unit. In the centre is how the box instructs you to build them, with the musician holding the bell over his shoulder and the standard bearer with the standard in his right hand. With a few extra parts, it's easy enough to distinguish the units though by kind of adapting on these. This musician with the bell on his head is definitely my favourite one, I suppose, of the group, and always created a bit of entertainment on the table. I also green stuffed a tricorn for this unit champion, just to lean into the nautical theme of Guttrot Spume, which is a figure I started painting but never ended up finishing for the army. This was also the inspiration for the basing that I used on the army, which mostly uses this Vallejo water texture, which is a sort of acrylic alternative to a resin water base. I painted that over a greeny brown base on the bases themselves, and then created bubbles out of green stuff, which you then paint over with a water effect to achieve this sort of design on them. Unfortunately, it seems to have misted up with time, but if you run a finger over it, it does seem to clear up a little bit. The other parts of the bases are just using some bark to create this kind of rock effect for some of the champions, to single them out. A sort of orangey moss and some tufts that I got from Geek Gaming Scenics. The Sorcerer figure is an alternative sculpt from the Warhammer Underworlds range. This is from a group called the Wurmspat, which is a group of 3 figures. I ended up using the other 2 just as extra Blight Kings to create a bit more variety in those units. But I'm quite fond of these figures. I just cut them off their sculpted bases and redid them in the same technique that I've used for the rest of the army to tie them in a bit better. The other 2 mortal characters for the army are the Lord of Blight, who came in a start collecting box. I based him on a door from the Lake Town House kit that I'd used for some terrain with something else. And of course the Harbinger of Decay, which uses the old Nurgle Lord on demonic mount from 6th edition. It's simply a fantastic sculpt that's held up so well over the years. It's a model you fairly often hear among people's favourite sculpts of all time, and it's certainly on my list as well as one of those. So here's the Harbinger of Decay in a bit more detail. You can really see the sort of texturing that I've tried to do on the horse flesh there, just to see where it's stretched around the bone. So using very, very fine repeated strokes with increasingly lighter colours just to build up those highlights naturally over there. And then the same sort of technique is used on his robe as well, with different shades of grey, and on the horse's hair. There's a lot of interest all over the sculpt with the kind of different 2 sides of the horse's head, one with the flesh and one exposed bone. And this sort of way they've incorporated the Nurgle kind of 3 orbs into that mark on the back of the horse. It holds up so well as a sculpt still these days, so really fond of this model. For the demons, I have a block of 30 Plaguebearers, which I batch painted all in one go, using a simple but really effective method devised by Tyler Mengel of Mengel Miniatures fame. The technique was shared on the Warhammer community page. I've put a link to that below. The method itself was mostly dry brushes and washes of various hues, and then edge highlighting is the last stage to kind of detract from the chalkiness that you get with light dry brushes on tops of things. Again, based in all the same way as the other figures. I find the swords themselves are a little bit flimsy. A lot of ones with this sculpt, where the sword is going kind of across the face, have ended up snapping off with really not that much travel or use. Because of the general spikiness of Chaos figures and the size of some of the models I had, like the Great Unclean One, I ended up magnetising the bases to transport these using metal sheets like the Magnarack system by Battle Foam. So even with quite a small amount of transport, and I haven't used the army much, and the kind of delicacy of using magnets rather than foam and things like that, it's a bit of a shame they've ended up snapping, but I guess that's something just to be careful of with these sculpts in particular. Here's a closer look at one of the Plaguebearers. You can see there's quite a lot of shading around where all the wounds are, just to give lots of variety in the skin colour so that it isn't all the same across the entire unit. So that's mostly using kind of crimson washes around those, and then a sepia wash wherever there's boils, and those are highlighted using slightly different colours. It's a really effective technique, and like I said, it doesn't actually take that long if you're doing a whole group of 30 in one go. I used pretty much the same technique on the big lad himself, with a few extra steps just to kind of emphasise some of the highlights a bit more with something as much exposed skin as he has. Had a bit of fun with the basing as well, with the obligatory squished Nurgling on one side, and then two slightly converted ones around the front, so one enjoying a spa day on that rock face I built up for the base, and the other one dangling off a bit of his intestine. The technique, it really is very similar to what I used with the Plaguebearers. So started off with dry brush on the skin just to reinforce the kind of where the highlights would be, but then a lot of detail brush work over the top of that to reinforce the highlights and the shades where they are, and then glazing around instead of washes for this one, the cuts and exposed areas to build up some more variety in the skin tones. And then all the more detailed stuff after the skin, so the bones and the metalwork and the nails and horns and things like that. And last, the obligatory tree. I was never a huge fan of the whole faction terrain rules they introduced in Age of Sigmar, but I can understand both from a business and hobby perspective why they would encourage it. Even if it doesn't spark enthusiasm in people to make more terrain, then at least the tables end up being a little bit more interesting for them being on them. Transporting them around, however, was quite a pain. Most lists at the time ran about 3 trees, with which to catapult your Blight Kings and so on across the board. I did one at least, but the amount of extra space you would need in a carrying case to get 3 of them around just didn't really seem worth the payoff for small games at the local club. If I do add on to this collection at some point, I imagine that I'll finish off Guttrot's Beam first of all. I at least did a base for him and started some of the base coats, but never got much further than that. I also have 2 Pusgoyle Blight Lords, which came with a start collecting kit. Again, base coated and slightly based, but not too much done on those either. And still in box, Sloppity Bile Piper. I just love the sculpt on this guy, who's merry bagpipes. But again, never painted that, so one day perhaps as a kind of palette cleanser from Dwarves I might do those. So, there's the collection. A bit of a different video for the channel. I might make a few more of these just to document the collections I've put all those hours into. In the depths of most of the projects I've done in the hobby, I've always turned to videos of others' collections as a bit of inspiration and encouragement to crack on and finish. That was definitely the case with this lot, that I painted up during the final write-up year of my PhD, and I guess fittingly for Nurgle, the first year of COVID, so it was a welcome distraction during a fairly stressful time on all counts. It would be lovely to think this video might serve the same way for someone else. Most of the games I played with the army were around the 1,000-point scale at my local Games Workshop store. By the time that organised events had returned, I was on a bit of a break from the hobby, or rather from Games Workshop products. I did, however, get to display the collection for Armies on Parade in 2021, which I was fortunate enough to receive gold for Age of Sigmar, so I was really pleased with that. That was using a past attempt at a display board, using foam flocks and so on, but I wasn't too happy with how the grass turned out on it. That's what really led me to experiment with the basket liner technique I've used here. I'll put a link to the tutorial I made for this technique on a card at the top of the video. So that's all for today. Hope your hobbying is going well, and I look forward to seeing you in the not too distant future with another Dwarf update.